Thank you, Madam Speaker. I feel today, as do many, a sense of déjà vu, because it was almost exactly 1 year ago today that our late leader, Jack Layton, stood in this House under very similar circumstances. And he stood to oppose this government's legislation to force out locked out Canada Post workers. And we should remember that they were locked out from Canada Post and to force them back to work. When I talk about the lockout, it's important to remember that it was this government that had locked those workers out in the first place. So when it comes to collective bargaining, there's a word for this. It's a word that is part of ordinary language, but has a specific meaning when it comes to collective agreement. It's called bad faith. And rarely has there been such an egregious example of bad faith on the part of a government as this. Let's not forget that the government looks at workers at Canada Post. They're working. The government puts them in lockout, prevents them from working, and then turns around and says, oh, my goodness, they're not working anymore. What are we going to do? We need special legislation to force them back to work. And we started on an exercise that is an illustration of a heavy trend by the Conservatives since they've come to power, and that is to violate collective rights, to attack workers, to use all the means available to them as a majority government, to send a clear signal to the employers this time. And that message is that it's an open bar on the rights of workers. Don't be taken in. Collective rights, the Supreme Court, rights guaranteed under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. That's all for another day. We're here to impose our new law and order, and it's open bar for bosses. That's the message being given by the Conservatives, Madam Speaker. After Canada Post, of course, there was Air Canada. And the reaction was just immediate. Today, it's Canada Pacific. So this government has imposed 3 pieces of back-to-work legislation over this session of Parliament alone, 3 bills in less than 12 months. Compare that to what happened over the recent years, and you will understand the difference and the message that they're trying to send. There were only, in all the 1990s, only 9 back-to-work bills. And during the 1980s, and the Conservatives were in power mostly during the 1980s, there were only 6 back-to-work bills. So you can see the difference. There are 3 bills here in 12 months. And as my colleague just said, it's over 20 times now that they've imposed a gag order, a guillotine, in order to take away the right of parliamentarians to speak on things that are as important as the budget. That is the heavy trend of gagging and keeping quiet, keeping silent the people in this House. Today, it's more than the conflict at Canada Pacific that's at issue. There was Canada Post, Air Canada as well, but this is something that is defining about the Conservative approach, and that is to lower the standards for every single Canadian in all respects.
Example since the Conservatives came to power of lowering the standard of living of Canadians. This is the first generation where we've seen the middle class start to lose. Over the past 25 years, the earnings of the top 20% in our society have increased, a tendency that we've observed throughout the history of the country. But for the other 80%, living conditions, wages, the middle class, they have actually seen that drop. It's the first time in Canadian history we've observed that. And it's a heavy tendency. It's one that we keep observing, and it's a series of actions by this government. And today's attack on collective bargaining rights, on labour rights, on rights that are preserved and guaranteed by the Charter, preserved and guaranteed and enforced by the courts, the Conservatives are again attacking workers and their rights in this country. Some of the choices that they've made over the years, of course, have resulted in the pressures that they now say they have to react to by cutting everything in the budget. For example, we look at the employment insurance. Take a 30% pay cut, ship yourself a couple of hours out of town, take any job that presents itself, otherwise you're going to lose the employment insurance that you paid into with your own money and your employer paid into, you're going to lose that right. You remember, Madam Speaker, in 2009 when they double closed the door that the Liberals had already closed, when they had emptied out, and it had gone all the way to the Supreme Court, they had emptied out $50 billion from the employment insurance account. Now, they turned that into general revenue of the government. So a lot of people said, well, it was government money before and it's government money now. What does that change? Well, here's what it changes. The $50 billion in question was paid into the employment insurance account by every single employee for a specific purpose, to take care of them during the cyclical ups and downs of the economy. It was paid in by every single employer. Whether that employer was earning a good profit, breaking even, or losing money, you still had to pay in for every single employee. When they emptied out the EI account, they created a $50 billion fiscal space. What became of that $50 billion fiscal space? It was turned into tax reductions for the richest corporations. Now, the Conservatives don't like it when we say for the richest corporations. They'll argue that it's for all corporations. Let's look at the facts. A company that was breaking even or losing money certainly didn't benefit from a tax reduction. It wasn't paying any. And in these tough economic times, especially for any export sector, including the fisheries, the forest, and manufacturing, a lot of them were losing money or barely breaking even. So the money that they had paid in for a specific purpose to provide that insurance in case of unemployment, when the 2008 crisis hit, that cupboard was bare. And it had been emptied because that money had been turned over to the wealthiest corporations like the banks and the oil companies. That's the record of the Conservatives and the Liberals, and that's why the NDP is standing up today and saying par leur choix.
By their choices, they are ensuring an imbalance in the economy that we built up since the Second World War. There are countries like Norway that are, like us, very rich in resources, but they've learned to deal with the challenges that this represents. We don't have that. Development of natural resources without applying the basic principle of polluter pay, and the results are ensuring an imbalance in the economy that we built since the Second World War. There was a time when average folks from Langley to St. John's could count on a decent job with fair wages that supported their family. They could rely on a pension that let them retire with dignity and on an EI system that was there to help them when needed. But no, during a conference in the Swiss Alps with billionaires, our Prime Minister decided to play to the gallery and demonstrate that he could give a lesson in morals to the less well-off and tell them that even if they had worked their entire lives in construction, even if they had worked hard in a plant, they weren't working hard enough for him, because he was going to add an additional 2 years to their working lives, take $12,000 out of their pockets, because in his mind they wasn't productive enough, and he was taking those jobs off the market by so doing, taking away possibilities of employment for young people, a young generation that is already paying the heaviest environmental, social, and economic debt in history. These days, our young people who are studying their undergraduate studies in Canada pay $30,000 on average for tuition fees. How can a couple that owes $60,000 as they begin their careers buy a house? But when you take away the government's economic capacity to help in post-secondary education, as it did previously, this is the result. They create the conditions, and this is the same thing as what happened with the lockout for the Canada Post workers. Then they can no longer help them. What did they do with the money? They gave it to companies that are creating jobs. The Royal Bank didn't create jobs recently, except last year. Canadian chartered banks had $30 billion in benefits. $15 billion in bonuses for their senior officials, we had available fiscal space, and it should be given to companies based on their ability to create jobs, and that is what a government is supposed to do.
This government is trying to tell Canadians that we have to accept less, that we should accept lower wages, weaker pensions, and they are trying to create for employers an unlimited pool of cheap labor. It's a commonplace and it's almost a caricature, but it's the Minister of Human Resources last week in response to a question in a press conference who specifically cited the creation of workers for McDonald's. It's not a hyperbole on the part of the opposition. That's what they actually said. One of the ministers responsible for finance said, well, of course, if a teacher is looking for a job in Newfoundland, we've got jobs in the mines. This is their philosophy. This is money that belongs to the workers. They think that it belongs to McDonald's, and they're creating a system for employers and evacuating workers' rights. And this special legislation, forcing the workers back on their jobs despite the collective bargaining process, is just a full illustration of exactly what they're up to: lowering workers' rights, lowering the ability of the middle class to pay for itself, evacuating the capacity of the government to provide services. That's the agenda of the Conservatives. And it's important to note that they're not just affecting any one union or any one group of people, but all Canadians. That's the Conservative vision. Under their policies, we're becoming the first generation that will leave less to our children than what we inherited from our parents. New Democrats will not let that happen. Collective bargaining is guaranteed by the Charter and by the Supreme Court of Canada. Collective bargaining benefits all Canadians. Better wages, workplace safety, a 40-hour work week, a weekend where you can actually be with your family. The list goes on, but the Conservatives are determined to dismantle it. They're undermining this right, and it's unprecedented in Canada. Air Canada, the government didn't even wait for a strike to begin to bring in legislation, didn't bother to allow negotiated settlement to happen. The Labour Minister says she will intervene in any dispute she feels impacts the economy. Last time I checked, every working Canadian contributes to the economy. That basically means no more rates. The minister is saying no labour negotiation is safe from Conservative interference. The approach is unbalanced, it's heavy-handed, it's against the Charter, and it will be enforced, but it'll take time. Taking sides helps no one. Sends a terrible message that legislative settlement is the new labour relations norm in Canada. No incentive for the parties to negotiate in good faith if they know the government will step in. Why would an employer who's already received the clear signal from the government, we saw it in Canada Post, we're seeing it again, what possible incentive do they have to bargain in good faith with their employees? They could just fold their arms and say, you're going to be forced back to work. We don't care. Of course, the government doesn't care either, but they're willing to do the bidding of any employer that asks. That's what we're here standing up against today, Madam Speaker. The government's creating a slippery slope where no one will get a fair deal. Canadians relied on collective bargaining rights for decades. The government must respect the right of future generations to live with the same security past generations have had. What we're leaving our children is a defining issue of our times. As I mentioned, the middle class is struggling like never before. Income disparity at levels not seen since the Great Depression. We are one of the richest countries in the world, and yet we're one of the countries with the greatest disparity between the richest and the poor. Ça vaut la peine de le remarquer.
It's worth pointing out, between the those who have the most in our society and those who are the most disadvantaged, the gap is the hugest, and that's only really been accentuated since the Conservatives came to power. It hasn't been seen since the Depression. Security that Canadians have once sensed is gone, and this is not by chance. Let's look at what's happening in the Saguenay region. And Rio Tinto bought Alcannon when they did so. They didn't just buy the factories. Rio Tinto is a foreign corporation, and they became the owner of the bed of the Saguenay River. Think about that. It has to be to Canada's net advantage. It's written in the legislation when there is that kind of control taken by a foreign international business. So this is now viewed as being worth $1 billion. Things won't be done. Even when they did the analyses, they ticked off net benefit for Canada. And what's happened? Well, responsible authorities, those responsible rather for competition, said that we'll get rid of that part of the business. That's fine. We'll sell it to the Americans. And what happened afterwards? The Americans flipped it to an Indian business, to a multinational there. And what happened? Well, no problem. Jobs have been shipped off to the States and no protection for workers, and that's the Conservatives' attitude. Rio Tinto, and look at closely at what's happening, they're still just fine with all of this. For them, it's just a warning. The people come and destroy villages, and they leave people at the gates of the village and say, look at the model of what's coming. You better get in line. They are dismantling and destroying decades and generations of protections that help all of society by dismantling our entire protection system for protecting workers.
Let's look at the Conservative net benefit, shall we? We've just looked at Rio Tinto Alcan in Alma in the Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean region. Workers have been on lockout for 6 months. Net benefit for Canada, have everybody locked out, Madam Speaker. Inco, the Conservatives approved the takeover by Brazil's Vale in 2006. Vale proposes in 2009 to end defined benefit pensions for new employees. Then the USWA goes on strike, and it lasts nearly 1 year. That's the future for workers under the Conservatives. Falconbridge, Swiss-based mining company Xstrata absorbs Falconbridge in 2006. Takeover deal says no layoffs for 3 years. 2009, Xstrata lays off 700 people. 700 families lose their living because they don't understand that a net benefit means not just a net benefit for the shareholders, but also a net benefit for the families that work there. Now, here's one of the best illustrations of the Conservatives' approach. And I'll start with a reference to what happened during the 2011 general election, because our current Prime Minister went out and visited a lovely company in London, Ontario called Electromotive Diesel. He used it as a backdrop. He used it as a model. As a matter of fact, since there was nothing that they wouldn't do, during the election they touted a $5 million tax break, no strings attached. You don't have to create any work. You can just take the $5 million. That was what he did during the 2011 election campaign. Because, you see, a U.S. company called Caterpillar had bought Electromotive Diesel in 2010. So what happened in the months that followed? January 2012, 450 Electromotive Diesel employees are locked out. Why? Well, because they were being unreasonable. Because they were only being asked to take a 50% pay cut. And that was all part of the... After all, the company had been given $5 million, so they were only asking for 50%. Otherwise, it must have been 60% they were thinking of. February 2012, just a few months ago, the plant is closed. The operations moved. What a net benefit for Canada. The government has announced plans last week to raise takeover review to $1 billion, and there'll be even more reckless foreign takeovers that'll fly under the radar. Other working Canadians are forced to fight for their pension funds that they paid into for their golden years. Moi, je me souviens.
I recall when the Prime Minister stood up to say that he wouldn't touch pensions. That is one of my favorite moves that this government has made. The Prime Minister said, we won't touch pensions. And when they added 2 years onto that, and the Minister of Finance stood up and said,
pensions? We never said we wouldn't touch old age security. As if for the average Canadian it wasn't one and the same thing, their revenue when they were going to retire. Unprecedented attacks on workers, unprecedented attacks on the middle class. That's the legacy of the Conservatives. That's why we're here standing up today, Madam Speaker.
questions.